My name is Jackson Reed, and for as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to the flames. Not in some reckless, dangerous way, but with a deep sense of purpose. Growing up in a small town nestled against the edge of California's wildlands, I'd seen fires carve paths of destruction, threatening lives and livelihoods. My father was a firefighter before me, and I grew up watching him face those infernos with equal parts courage and humility. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a calling. When I turned 20, I followed in his footsteps, joining the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. For 22 years, firefighting became my life. I lived and breathed it. Every call was a chance to make a difference, to protect people and give them hope in the face of devastation. I've always believed in God, and I've always felt His presence in the firehouse and on the front lines. It's hard not to when you're walking into situations where the odds seem stacked against you, yet somehow you come out on the other side. There were times I felt like I could hear Him in the roar of the flames or see His hand in the way things turned out. But in the last few years, something began to shift. The fires got worse, bigger, hotter, and more unpredictable. We used to have a fire season. Now it felt like fire season never ended. Entire communities were wiped out in hours, and no matter how hard we fought, it seemed like we were always one step behind. I couldn't help but wonder why. Why were things getting so out of control? Was it just bad luck, climate change, or something deeper? That question weighed on me, especially during the fires of 2025. The fires that changed everything. The wildfires that year were like nothing I'd ever seen. They didn't just destroy forests and homes. They felt personal, like they were alive, targeting every vulnerable place they could find. Even with decades of experience, I felt helpless, like I was fighting an enemy I couldn't see or understand. I prayed more than ever during that time, asking God for guidance, for strength, for answers. But instead of clarity, I felt a growing sense of doubt. Was I really making a difference? Was my work still part of His plan? The morning of January 15th started like any other day. I was on call as part of a task force sent to assist with one of the largest fires raging in Southern California. Our team had been working nonstop for days, rotating shifts to get what little rest we could. The air was thick with smoke, turning the sky a dull, eerie orange. Even after all these years, I wasn't used to it. The way the air tasted metallic, the way the heat seemed to seep into your bones. But there was no time to dwell on it. Lives were at stake. The final call. We got the call around 7 a.m. A small community on the edge of the fire line had been evacuated, but a handful of people were still unaccounted for. Some were elderly, unable to move quickly, while others had stayed behind to try to save their homes. It wasn't safe for them to stay, and our job was to get them out before the fire turned their way. It was the kind of mission I'd done 100 times before, but something about this one felt different. I couldn't shake the sense that today would be a turning point, though I didn't know why. When we arrived at the scene, the fire was still a few miles away, but the wind was picking up. A bad sign. Wildfires move fast enough on their own, but with wind, they can become unstoppable. We split into teams, going door to door, to make sure everyone was accounted for. Most of the houses were empty, their occupants long gone, but in one home, We found an elderly woman who hadn't been able to leave on her own. She was sitting in a chair, clutching a photo album to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "This is all I have left." I knelt beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure you're safe," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. "But we need to go now. You can bring the album with you." Her grip on the album tightened, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't move. But then she nodded, letting us guide her to safety. I carried her to our truck, where one of my teammates stayed behind to drive her to the evacuation center. As I turned to head back toward the neighborhood, I noticed the wind had shifted again, blowing harder than before. A chill ran down my spine, and I grabbed my radio. "Command, this is Reed," I said. "The wind's picking up. We need to wrap this up fast." "Copy that, Reed," came the response. "Be advised, the fire is moving faster than expected. Stay alert." We moved quickly, checking the last few houses. Most were empty, but in the final home, we found a young father and his 2 kids struggling to pack up what little they could carry. The kids were crying, and the father looked on the verge of panic. "I can't leave everything behind," he said, his voice breaking. "You have to," I said firmly. "Things can be replaced. Your lives can't." He hesitated, but when the kids clung to him, he relented. We helped them to the truck, loading them up just as the fire crested the hill behind their house. When fire becomes fury, the flames roared like a freight train, and for a moment, it felt like the world was on fire. My heart pounded as I turned to my partner. "We need to move now." But as we started to leave, the wind shifted again, and suddenly, the fire was everywhere. It came faster than I thought possible, cutting us off from the main road. The smoke was so thick I could barely see, and the heat was suffocating. My radio crackled to life, but the signal was weak. "Reed, what's your status?" "We're trapped," I said, coughing, trying to find another way out. Every instinct told me to panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. "This isn't how it ends," I whispered under my breath. "God, I need you now." We managed to find a narrow dirt path that led away from the flames, but the fire was closing in fast. The truck shook as embers pelted the windshield, and I could feel the heat through the doors. My partner shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of the flames. All I could do was pray, and then everything went dark. The light beyond. I thought it was the end, but what came next changed everything. When I opened my eyes, I didn't know where I was at first. I thought I was dreaming. The world around me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was light, not the harsh, artificial glare of hospital fluorescence or the flickering orange of fire, but a soft, radiant glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't just light, it was warmth, a warmth that wrapped itself around me and settled deep into my very being. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. For someone who'd spent a lifetime surrounded by a chaos, the roar of flames, the blaring sirens, the shouting voices of teammates, the silence was almost disorienting. But it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. A kind of silence that wasn't absence but fullness, as if the quiet itself carried meaning. I looked down, expecting to see my body, my hands, my boots, scuffed from the fire line. But what I saw stopped me cold. I wasn't there. Or rather, I was, but not in the way I had always understood myself to be. My body, the thing I'd relied on for decades to pull people from danger, to hold a hose steady in the face of roaring flames, wasn't there. And yet I felt more alive, more real than I ever had before. It was as if the physical part of me had been stripped away, leaving only my essence, my soul, if you will. That's when I noticed the peace. It wasn't just around me, it was inside me, filling every corner of what I now realized was me, not the body I'd left behind. I felt weightless, free in a way I'd never imagined. Every worry, every fear, every ounce of exhaustion that had clung to me like a second skin was gone. In its place was a stillness so profound it brought tears to my eyes. If I'd still had eyes to cry with. For a moment, I wondered if I was dead. The thought should have terrified me, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like an answer to a question I hadn't realized I'd been asking my whole life. If this was death, it wasn't something to fear. It was beautiful. The presence. As I stood or floated or existed, whatever it was I was doing, I began to notice more about the space around me. The light wasn't just light. It was alive, pulsating gently as if it had a heartbeat. It didn't hurt to look at, but it was impossible to fully comprehend. It shifted and shimmered, taking on colors I couldn't name and patterns that seemed to move with purpose. I could feel it too, not just on the surface of what used to be my skin, but inside me, as if it were part of me and I was part of it. And then there was the presence. I can't explain it in words, because words fall so far short of what it was. It wasn't a person or a voice, at least not in the way we understand those things. It was more like an awareness, a knowing that filled the space around me and within me. It was love, pure and unfiltered, the kind of love I'd only caught glimpses of in my life. It wasn't the conditional kind, the kind that depended on how good you were or how much you achieved. This love was absolute, unconditional, and it saw me, all of me, every failure, every doubt, every mistake, and it didn't flinch. For what felt like an eternity, and no time at all, I stood in that presence, letting it wash over me. There was no judgment, no shame, no sense of being measured or found lacking. Instead, there was acceptance, the kind that doesn't just tolerate you, but embraces you. I felt whole in a way I never had before, as if every broken piece of me had been gently gathered up and put back together. But even in the peace, questions began to form in my mind. Where was I? What had happened? Was this heaven? If it was, why didn't it look the way I'd imagined? Pearly gates, angels with harps, the whole bit. And what was I supposed to do now? I didn't have answers, but I had the sense that they would come, that this was just the beginning. Between worlds. As I stood there, I began to see glimpses of the world I'd left behind. It was faint at first, like looking through frosted glass. But the more I focused, the clearer it became. I could see my body slumped over in the cab of the fire truck, smoke swirling around me as my partner shouted for help. I could see the paramedics arriving, their faces tense as they worked to revive me. It should have been unsettling, watching my own lifeless form from above, but it wasn't. I felt no attachment to it, no fear of leaving it behind. It was like looking at an old coat I'd outgrown. But as I watched, I began to notice something else. The fire that had surrounded us wasn't just flames and smoke. It was more. In the spiritual plane, it seemed alive, twisting and writhing like a living thing. And it wasn't alone. There were shapes in the fire, dark and shadowy, moving with purpose. They weren't human, and they weren't animals, but they carried an unmistakable malice. They seemed to feed off the destruction, growing stronger as the fire consumed more. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if I was being shown something important, something I needed to understand. The world I'd left behind wasn't just a physical reality. It was layered with a spiritual dimension that influenced everything we thought we knew. The fires, the destruction, the chaos, it was all connected to something deeper, something unseen but very real. Just as the weight of that realization began to settle on me, I felt the presence grow stronger, more focused. The light around me shifted, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Someone was approaching, though approaching isn't quite the right word. It was more like they were unfolding into my awareness, becoming more real with each passing moment. I turned, or at least I think I did, and saw him. The divine encounter. He was unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined, yet he felt familiar, like I'd known him my whole life. His presence was both overwhelming and comforting, powerful and gentle. I didn't need to ask who he was. Deep down, I already knew. And then I saw him, the one I never expected to meet. When I saw him, I froze. There are moments in life when time feels like it slows down, when you're so overwhelmed by what's happening that it seems like the world itself has shifted. That's what this was. Except it wasn't just the world that had shifted. It was everything. He stood before me, or perhaps stood isn't the right word, because he wasn't bound by the rules of physical space. His presence filled the air around me, as if he were both near and everywhere at once. His face was radiant, shining, with a light so pure and so full of love that it was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet for all its majesty, there was a tenderness in his expression, a familiarity that made me feel like I'd known him forever. I didn't need an introduction. I didn't need to ask who he was. Deep down, I knew. Every part of me recognized him, even parts I hadn't known existed. This was Jesus. The realization hit me like a wave, and I felt every emotion at once: fear, awe, gratitude, unworthiness. My knees buckled under the weight of it all, and I found myself bowing before him, not because I thought I should, but because I couldn't do anything else. His presence was overwhelming, and yet it didn't crush me. Instead, it lifted me, held me, made me feel more alive than I'd ever been. "Jackson," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just a sound, it was a truth, a calling, a love so profound it seemed to echo through every fiber of my being. "Do not be afraid." I wanted to respond, to tell him I wasn't afraid, but that wasn't entirely true. I was afraid of what this moment meant, afraid of why I was here. But his voice washed over me like a balm, and the fear began to melt away, replaced by something else: peace, trust. "You have questions," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, an acknowledgement of the storm that had been raging inside me. "Ask them." I looked up, my voice trembling. Why am I here? I asked. Why me? He smiled, a smile that carried infinite understanding and compassion. Because I love you, he said simply, and because you have a purpose. The words hit me like a lightning bolt. Purpose. I'd spent my whole life trying to live with purpose, to make a difference, to do something meaningful. But in the chaos of recent years, I'd started to lose sight of that. The fires, the destruction, they'd left me questioning everything. And now here he was, telling me I had a purpose. But why now? I asked. Why this way? I don't understand. You will, he said gently. But first, there are things you must see. The revelation. As he spoke, the space around us began to shift. It was as if the very fabric of reality was changing, pulling back layers I hadn't even known were there. Suddenly, we were no longer standing in the ethereal light. We were looking down at the world I had just left. I could see the fires raging, consuming everything in their path. But it wasn't just the physical flames I saw. There was something deeper, something more sinister. These fires, Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, are not merely natural disasters. They are the physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. I stared in disbelief as the fires took on a new dimension. Within the flames, I saw shapes, dark, shadowy figures, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. They weren't human, and yet they carried an intelligence, a malice that was undeniable. They seemed to feed off the destruction, growing stronger with every acre burned, every home lost. What are they? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They are the fruits of spiritual corruption, he said. The fires you see are the result of choices made in the hearts of my people for generations. They have turned away from me, choosing the ways of the world over the ways of truth. Each act of selfishness, each rejection of love, each embrace of fear and hatred has fed this darkness. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I processed his words. But why would you let this happen? I asked. Why would you allow so much pain and destruction? His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw both sorrow and hope. Because I love them, he said. Love does not force itself. It does not compel or coerce. It invites. It calls. It waits. The fires are a warning, Jackson. A call to return to me. They are painful, yes, but they are also merciful. They reveal what has been hidden, bringing darkness into the light so that it can be healed. I looked back at the fires, the shadows, the destruction. And what am I supposed to do? I asked. I'm just one person. How can I make a difference in all of this? He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the weight of his love was almost too much to bear. You have a voice, he said, and you have a story to tell. What you have seen here is not just for you, it is for the world. You must share it, Jackson. You must tell them the truth. I felt the weight of his words, the enormity of the task he was laying before me. But what if they don't listen? I asked. What if they mock me, reject me? He smiled again, that same compassionate smile that seemed to hold the universe. Some will, he said, but others will hear. And for those who do, your words will be the seed that begins to grow. It is not your job to control the outcome. It is your job to be faithful. I swallowed hard, the doubts still swirling in my mind. Why me? I asked again. I'm not special. I'm not a prophet or a preacher. I'm just a firefighter. That is why I chose you, he said, because you are humble, because you know the value of service and sacrifice. You have been faithful with little, and now I am entrusting you with much. He looked at me with eyes that held both eternity and love, and then he said, Jackson, this is what you must tell them. The message. As I stood there, transfixed by the presence of Jesus and the gravity of his words, the world around us began to shift again. It wasn't disorienting or chaotic. It felt purposeful, like a veil being lifted to reveal what had always been there, but hidden from view. The fires I had seen before, the physical flames devouring homes and landscapes, came back into focus. But this time, I saw them differently. They weren't just fires. They were alive, pulsating, with a darkness that seemed to breathe and grow as they consumed everything in their path. Within the flames, I could see shapes, shadowy figures moving with sinister intent. They weren't physical beings, but they radiated malice and hunger. They fed off the destruction, gaining strength as the fire spread. It was a vision of chaos, but also of precision, as if these dark forces were orchestrating the devastation with a purpose. These are not just wildfires, Jesus said, his voice cutting through the vision like a beam of light. What you see is the reflection of a deeper spiritual reality. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What do you mean? I asked, though I already felt the weight of the answer forming in my chest. Jackson, he said, his eyes filled with both sorrow and compassion. These fires are the result of a world that has turned away from me. They are not merely accidents or natural disasters. They are manifestations of choices made over generations. Each flame you see represents more than physical destruction. It reflects spiritual apathy, disconnection, and the pursuit of self over truth. As he spoke, the vision shifted again. I saw scenes of everyday life, people rushing through crowded cities, their faces buried in their phones, families sitting in silence, each person absorbed in their own screen, churches filled with people going through the motions of faith, but lacking the passion and purpose that true worship brings. It wasn't just apathy I saw. It was something deeper, a sense of emptiness that had seeped into every corner of society. This is the spiritual landscape of the world, Jesus continued. The fires you fight on the ground are fueled by the fires in the hearts of my people, fires of greed, fear, anger, and pride. These forces create the conditions for destruction, both physical and spiritual. The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I struggled to make sense of it all. But why? I asked. Why would people choose this? Why would they turn away from you? It is not always a conscious choice, he said gently. Many do not reject me outright. They simply allow other things to take my place. They prioritize comfort over conviction, entertainment over engagement, and self-interest over sacrifice. Over time, these small compromises create a separation, a distance that grows until the truth is no longer visible. The vision shifted again, and I saw the fires spreading across California, consuming everything in their path. But now I could see the connection between the physical and the spiritual. Each blaze seemed to be anchored to a point of darkness, a place where spiritual corruption had taken root. In some areas, the darkness was so thick it was almost tangible, pulsating with an energy that felt oppressive and cold. What can be done? I asked, my voice trembling. How can we stop this? Jesus turned to me, his expression both hopeful and firm. Not all is lost, he said. There are still points of light, places and people who remain faithful, who live in love and truth. These lights push back the darkness, creating spaces where the fires cannot take hold. As he spoke, the vision shifted once more. This time, I saw small pockets of light scattered across the state. In these places, the fires struggled to advance. The flames were still present, but they burned less fiercely, as if held back by an invisible barrier. I saw families praying together, communities coming together to serve and support one another, and individuals choosing to live with integrity and purpose despite the chaos around them. These lights represent my people who have not forgotten me, Jesus said. Where they stand firm in faith, the forces behind the fires cannot gain a foothold. Their love, their prayers, their commitment to truth create a spiritual shield that protects not just them, but those around them. I felt a surge of hope as I watched the points of light holding back the darkness, but it was tempered by the realization of how few they were compared to the vastness of the fires. Is it enough? I asked. Are there enough of them to make a difference? That depends, Jesus said, his tone growing more urgent. It depends on whether my people will wake up to the truth. This is not just a physical battle. It is a spiritual one, and it cannot be won with human effort alone. He turned to face me fully, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. This is why you are here, Jackson, he said. You must tell them what you have seen. You must help them understand that the fires cannot be stopped by firefighting techniques or government policies alone. The root of the problem is spiritual, and the solution lies in a return to me. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt the weight of the mission he was giving me, and it both terrified and humbled me. How? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How do I tell them? How do I make them see? Speak the truth, he said simply. Tell them what you have seen and what you have learned. Some will listen and some will not. That is not for you to control. Your task is to be faithful, to shine a light in the darkness. The vision shifted one final time, and I saw a future divided. In one path, the fires grew worse, consuming not just land, but lives, communities, and hope itself. In the other, the lights began to spread, joining together to form a network of faith and love that pushed back the darkness. In this path, the fires became manageable. Their destructive power diminished as the spiritual atmosphere changed. Time is running out, Jesus said, his voice filled with urgency. The choice must be made soon. Tell them, Jackson. Tell them that I love them, that I am calling them back to me, but also tell them that the time for indecision is over. They must choose. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the love that radiated from him was almost overwhelming. Remember this, he said. Every act of faith, every prayer, every moment of love and sacrifice creates a ripple effect in the spiritual realm. It is not in vain. Even the smallest light can push back the greatest darkness. As the vision began to fade, his final words echoed in my mind. The fires are a warning, but they are also an invitation, a call to return to the truth. Share this message, Jackson, and know that I am with you always. Jesus warned me that the time to act was running out, and the next words he spoke would haunt me forever. The return. The first thing I felt was the weight of my body. After what felt like an eternity floating in peace and light, the sensation of gravity pressing against me was jarring. My chest rose and fell with a strained rhythm, every breath feeling like a monumental effort. I could hear faint beeping sounds and distant murmurs, but it took a moment for my mind to catch up to what was happening. I was back. The memory of where I'd been and what I'd seen came rushing back in a torrent. The light, the overwhelming love, Jesus' presence, the vision of the fires. It was all still vivid, etched into my soul, as though I'd lived it just seconds ago. But now I was here, back in the physical world, and the contrast was almost too much to bear. Jackson! A familiar voice broke through the haze. My wife, Olivia, was standing beside the hospital bed, her hand clutching mine tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, as if she hadn't slept in days. Relief washed over her features when she saw my eyes flutter open. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, and the only sound that came out was a hoarse rasp. Olivia grabbed a cup of water from the bedside table and helped me take a few small sips. The cool liquid soothed the dryness, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. How could I explain to her what had just happened? How could I tell her that while my body lay lifeless in this hospital bed, I had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere so real, so profound that it made this world feel like a shadow? The door to the room opened, and my two kids, Sophia and Ethan, peeked in hesitantly. Seeing their small faces filled with worry and hope brought a lump to my throat. "Daddy?" Sophia said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm okay," I managed to croak, forcing a small smile. It wasn't entirely true. I wasn't okay. Not yet. But I needed to reassure them. They rushed to my side, their little hands gripping mine as if they were afraid I might disappear again. Olivia leaned down and kissed my forehead, her tears landing softly on my skin. "You scared us," she said, trying to smile through her own emotions. "The doctors, they said you were gone for a few minutes. They said you shouldn't even be here right now." I closed my eyes, the enormity of her words settling over me. She didn't know how right she was. By all medical accounts, I had been dead. My heart had stopped. But what she couldn't know was what had happened in those minutes. What I had seen, what I had been told, and now, here I was, alive again, with a message that burned inside me like a fire I couldn't extinguish. The room filled slowly as more people arrived. My fellow firefighters, my parents, even my team captain. Their relief was palpable, their voices blending together as they took turns checking on me, sharing their gratitude that I had survived. I tried to focus, to engage with their words, but my mind kept drifting back to the vision, to the words Jesus had spoken to me. "You must tell them." The weight of that command settled heavily on my chest. Later that evening, when the room had cleared out and it was just Olivia and me, She sat down beside me, her expression filled with both love and concern. Jackson, she said gently, there's something different about you. I can see it in your eyes. What happened while you were gone? I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. How could I begin to explain what I had seen? Would she even believe me? Would she think I was delirious from the trauma? But I couldn't keep it inside, not from her. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was my wife. Taking a deep breath, I began to speak. My voice was shaky, my words faltering at first, but as I continued, they began to flow more easily. I told her about the light, about the peace and love I had felt. I told her about Jesus, how he had appeared to me, how his presence had filled me with a sense of hope, wholeness, and purpose I'd never known before. I told her about the vision, the fires, the shadows, the spiritual battle I had witnessed, and I told her about his command, his call for me to share what I had seen. Olivia listened in silence, her eyes never leaving mine. I expected doubt, maybe even disbelief, but what I saw in her expression was something else entirely. It was understanding. When I finished, she took my hand and squeezed it tightly. Jackson, she said softly, I believe you. Tears welled up in my eyes at her words. You do? I asked, my voice cracking. She nodded. I don't know how to explain it, but I can feel it. What you're saying, it's true. The message spreads. Over the following days, as I recovered in the hospital, I began to share my story with others. First with my closest family, then with a few trusted friends. Each time, I felt the same fear, the same uncertainty about how they would react. But to my surprise, most of them listened with open hearts. Some cried, others asked questions, and a few admitted that they too had felt a growing sense of unease about the state of the world. But not everyone was receptive. There were those who dismissed my story as a hallucination, a product of oxygen deprivation, or a near-death delusion. You've been through a lot, Jack, one of my coworkers said, patting my shoulder. I'm just glad you're okay. Don't overthink it. Their skepticism hurt, but it didn't shake my resolve. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was real. Jesus' words echoed in my mind every time I felt doubt creeping in. Tell them what you have seen. Be faithful, and leave the rest to me. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I felt stronger, not just physically, but spiritually. The world outside felt different to me now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. Every moment felt significant. Every interaction an opportunity to share the message I'd been given. As I walked through the doors of the hospital and into the sunlight, I knew my life would never be the same. I had been given a mission, and I was determined to fulfill it, no matter the cost. I knew sharing this message wouldn't be easy, but what I didn't realize was how it would change everything, for me and for those I loved. A new purpose. It's been several months since I woke up in that hospital bed, gasping for air and clutching onto life after what can only be described as a miracle. At first, sharing the vision felt like an impossible task. How do you put into words an experience so profound, so beyond anything this world understands? How do you tell people that the flames tearing through their homes and communities are more than just natural disasters? They are symptoms of a deeper spiritual battle. And yet, I knew I had no choice. Jesus' words were clear. Tell them what you have seen. I started small, sharing the message with those closest to me, my wife, my children, a few trusted friends. To my surprise, many of them didn't dismiss my story. Some cried as I described the overwhelming love I felt in Jesus' presence. Others admitted that they too had felt a growing sense of spiritual emptiness and disconnection in their lives. Those early conversations were difficult but transformative. Slowly, I began to see how my story was planting seeds in their hearts. Word spread quickly in our small community. Before I knew it, I was being invited to speak at local churches, community centers, and even schools. I would stand before these groups, trembling with a mix of nerves and conviction, and recount what I had seen: the light, the vision of the fires, the shadowy entities that fed off our apathy and disconnection, and the points of light that pushed back against the darkness. Each time, I emphasized the most important part of the message: the fires are a warning, but they are also an invitation. We are being called to return to faith, to love, and to Toti. At first, not everyone believed me. There were skeptics, of course, and some who outright mocked what I had to say. "Jackson, you've been through a traumatic experience," they would say. "Your mind's just trying to make sense of it all." I didn't argue with them. I couldn't force anyone to believe what I had seen. But I kept telling the story, trusting that the truth would resonate with those who were ready to hear it. And it did. Slowly but surely, I began to see the ripple effects of the message. Families who hadn't prayed together in years began setting aside time to connect with each other and with God. Churches that had become more about programs and less about purpose reopened their doors for extended hours of worship and prayer. People who had once been consumed by fear, anger, or selfishness started reaching out to their neighbors, offering help and encouragement. It wasn't just about religion, it was about faith in action, about living with intention and love. The most incredible part was seeing how these small acts of faith and kindness began to transform entire communities. In the places where people chose to come together in love and truth, the spiritual atmosphere changed. The darkness that had once felt so heavy and oppressive began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. Even the physical fires, though still devastating, seemed less overwhelming in these areas, as if the spiritual light was pushing back against the destruction. My own life changed in ways I never could have imagined. Sharing this message brought me closer to my family, my friends, and my community. But more importantly, it deepened my relationship with God. The doubts and fears that had plagued me before the experience were replaced by a sense of peace and purpose. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't need them. I knew I was walking the path I was meant to walk, and that was enough. Of course, it hasn't been easy. There are still days when the weight of the message feels overwhelming, when I question whether I'm doing enough or whether it's even making a difference. But in those moments, I remember Jesus' words: "Be faithful and leave the rest to me." I'm not responsible for changing hearts. That's God's work. My job is simply to share the truth and trust that it will reach those who need it. As I sit here reflecting on everything that has happened, I'm filled with gratitude for the second chance I've been given, for the love and support of those around me, and for the opportunity to share this message with you. I know that the world can feel dark and overwhelming at times, especially in the face of disasters like the fires. But I also know that there is hope. There is always hope. No matter how dark the world may seem, there is always light, and it starts with us. The time to choose is now. We each have the power to be a point of light in the darkness, to push back against fear and apathy with love and faith. It doesn't take grand gestures or perfect lives. It starts with small choices, a prayer, a kind word, a moment of selflessness. Those choices ripple outward, creating change in ways we may never fully see or understand. So I'm asking you, no, I'm urging you to consider your own life. Where is your light? What can you do to shine brighter, to bring hope and love to those around you? It's not too late. As long as there is breath in your lungs and love in your heart, there is time to make a difference. Thank you for listening to my story. It hasn't been easy to share, but I know it's what I was called to do. If this message resonated with you, I ask you to do one thing. Share it. Share it with your family, your friends, your community. Let it spark conversations, inspire action, and bring people together. And if you found this video meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it. Together, we can spread this message of hope and faith to those who need it most. God bless you, and remember, no matter how dark things may seem, there is always light. Be the light.